discovery was
lysergic acid diethylamide,
LSD.
誰？
Serial Experiments Lain is the kind of anime that only comes around once in a generation. It appeared in the late 90s, warning what would happen to the individual and to the world once life became fully wired to the internet. And to say it was accurate would be an understatement. To this day, people are still talking about it. Its use of existential philosophy, its reflections on identity and reality have kept viewers digging for decades. But there's one thing about this series that's gone largely unspoken. Something darker. I am talking about mind control. Not the sci-fi kind, the real experiments conducted by governments, private organisations and scientists throughout the 20th century. All trying to answer one question: how do you control a human mind? These experiments, conducted by our own governments, weren't just aimed at individuals. Their greater purpose was to control the collective, to reshape how we think, how we all act. And that's where Lain comes in. Because this show doesn't just depict those experiments, it is one. A real psychological test, disguised as fiction, where the subject isn't only Lain, or the people around her, but in some bizarre, groundbreaking way, it's us. But just like every experiment, this one has a designer. So to dig into this whole thing, we should first look at the show's version of exactly that. In Lain, it's the main antagonist, Masahiro Erie, who, much like the scientists behind MK Ultra and other mind control programs, is obsessed with controlling not just individuals, but the masses. A computer researcher from the fictional Tachibana Labs, Irie is the archetype of the brilliant but deranged scientist, the kind who appeared in real mind control programs throughout history. He views the wired, the show's version of the internet, as a higher plane of existence. To him, humanity's next step in evolution is merging with it completely. In his research, he develops Protocol 7, a system meant to strengthen the connection between humans and the wired. But in doing so, he discovers something unexpected. An omnipresent, half-conscious force, the being we come to know as Lain. Irie believes this entity is the key to his vision. If he can use Lain to erase the boundary between the real world and the wired, humanity will ascend, or at least that's what he tells himself. To achieve this, he transfers his consciousness into the network, leaving behind his physical body, and in doing so, begins the experiment, and where Lain's story begins. But what's most striking here isn't Erie's actual ambition, it's how he does it. Because how he does it reveals the show's connections to mind control. He is the unseen researcher behind the screen, the one who sets forth every event, every distortion, every shift in perception in order to not only control the minds of Lain, but as said before, us. And we're going to explain all of it. There's a reason why Erie made Lain the way she is. Lain is young, an impressionable teenager, a stage before the ego fully forms. In simple terms, she's unshaped clay. In various mind control experiments, those of her demographic were preferred due to better neural plasticity, a brain that is easier to shape. We see this preference in the work of Laurette Bender, who subjected those around Lain's age to traumatic experiments, to say the least. But Lain also possesses another factor that makes her the perfect candidate for Erie's experiment, and that is her ability to dissociate. Disassociation occurs when the mind's connected parts, memory, identity, perception, and emotion split apart. Reality loses cohesion, leaving the person detached from who and where they are. This is made clear from Lain from the start. On the train, she's unaware of her surroundings. At school, she sees classmates fade in and flash out of light. While others react emotionally to a dead girl's emails, Lain only stares, blank, disconnected. These are symptoms of disassociation. The same states mind control experiments often sought to induce, typically triggered by trauma. Disassociation is common in PTSD patients. The mind isolates unbearable experiences into separate self states to survive. Like a psychological circuit breaker, these states are desired. They leave the mind open to suggestion, to control. As MK Ultra doctors like Dr. Ewan Cameron found out, when he had caused sufficiently enough trauma turning patients into blank state vegetables, he found then that they could receive instructions, new beliefs, and even in some other experiments, completely different personalities. I think you know where I'm getting at. Lain, before even a thing has happened, is vulnerable to being controlled. And it's only a matter of time until someone or something takes advantage. Lain returns home from school, still detached from the world around her. In her dimly lit room, dressed in a bear onesie, she moves, as if hypnotized, drawn toward her Navi computer, where she finally opens it and finds a message from Chisa, the girl who took her own life. Chisa tells her that only her body is gone. Her mind now lives in the wired, where she's met God. The meaning of that claim isn't clear yet, but one thing is, Chisa is tempting Lain toward the wired. When Lain tells her mother about the message, she gets no reaction, so she turns to her father, who seems strangely eager to encourage her curiosity about computers, a curated liaison for her into the wired. Along with the rest of her family, they're a carefully created hoax. Though it's clear what her father's role in this play family is, her mother's is less so. Her apathy and general disconnect from Lain are deliberate. A mother's role is to anchor a child's emotional world, to shape their sense of safety and identity. Lain's mother does the opposite. Her coldness leaves Lain without an emotional compass, creating a void that someone else can fill, and soon someone will. Soon after this, the programming becomes obvious. On her journey to school, an accident occurs, and in doing so, subjects Lain to a hallucination, in which she sees a girl run onto the tracks. In a distorted vision, the girl displays contradicting facial expressions, from terror to a pleasured grin, right before she meets her inevitable end. Lain wakes up in class, tears spilling on her textbook, only to write on cue, see the symbols on the chalkboard. Form a message, come to the wired as soon as you can. This entire segment follows exactly the process of trauma-based mind control. After witnessing a horrific event, Lain, already predisposed to disassociation, is put into a PTSD fugue state, one in which her suggestibility is up, and the message is loud and clear: enter the wired. Just like Ewan Cameron would subject patients to intensive physical and psychological trauma, electric shocks and sense deprivation tanks before installing certain behaviours and messaging, what he would refer to in documents as psychic driving. But the connections don't stop there. As Lain wakes up from her trauma-induced dream, we immediately see the bear symbol on her pen, and there's a reason for that. You may have noticed the bear keeps showing up, the stuffed animals on her desk, the costume she wears while disassociating, the hat she puts on while glued to her computer. In trauma-based mind control literature, stuffed animals, i.e. teddy bears, have been used as anchors. An anchor is something that reactivates a programmed state, a sound, image, or phrase that flips a mental switch. An anchor works through conditioning and hypnotism, a neutral image tied to a moment of trauma, reinforced until it becomes a trigger. The bear, of course, evokes a childlike, helpless state, one that's easy to intimidate, guide, and command. Meaning every time we see it, we know Lain is pulled back into that conditioned vulnerability. keeping her receptive for further programming. And if this feels speculative, the show gives us a direct confirmation. Immediately after we see Lane's bearsuit, her father is shown searching for Think Blue, Count 2, a sci-fi story built entirely around subconscious trigger phrases. Put all this together and we're seeing a successful first test. But the programming stage is only just beginning, and so is yours. The truth? Serial Experiment Lain isn't just about a mind control narrative. Just like Lain has become a subject, so have we. Notice the show's slow, hypnotic pacing lulls us into a trance. The cryptic text cards speak directly to us. The constant hum of electricity overstimulates our senses until it becomes background noise, thrown into our subconscious, just like it does for Lain. Those aren't just stylistic choices, they're documented mechanisms of conditioning. And to understand how deep this experiment goes, we have to follow Lain further into the wired. Girls, aptly named, since this is where the operation of mind control is extended to multiple people. From the start we clearly see this. Lane's friends, once terrified by the strange emails from Chisa, now brush them off completely, almost forgetting them, a clear sign of disassociation. Soon after, Lain is invited by her friends to Club Siberia, who insist they'd seen her there the night before, acting completely differently. And they're right. Earlier in the episode we see a glimpse of another Lain, intense, confident, and dressed provocatively. Most likely a personality born from the previous episode's programming. When Lain finally arrives at Club Siberia, the show again mirrors real-world mind control experiments. The club hums with danger, designer drugs circulating among crowds of underage kids. It's also where we watch the courier's psyche fracture. Overstimulated by a new drug, Acela, he fires 2 bullets into the crowd. And when he sees Lain, he mutters 2 chilling lines. And at which Lain moves forward and responds, then he turns the gun on himself. To understand what's happening here, we have to look to its real-world parallel. Because Siberia isn't a club, it's a testing ground. The first steps toward mass mind control. In real life, when the CIA sought to understand how LSD could be used for psychological control, they realised pretty soon laboratory settings weren't enough. They needed the real world. Agents like George Hunter White ran operations out of hidden safe houses, where members of the public were unknowingly dosed with experimental substances. White later even said, "I was a very minor missionary. Actually, a heretic." Siberia mirrors this atmosphere perfectly. A space filled with vulnerable targets, underage kids, synthetic drugs, made in only what can be a laboratory, and an invisible network observing every reaction. This courier's breakdown makes it clear he's not in control of his own actions, yet he perceives Lain as the one manipulating him. This moment doesn't just expose Siberia's role as a testing site for group-level control, it also reveals something deeper. Lain has a third self, one who exists autonomously within the wired. And if every step so far has been orchestrated by Erie or his proxies, then perhaps even this tragedy was another layer of programming, designed to isolate Lain further, to sever her from the physical world and draw her deeper into the digital one. Whatever the case, the programmer is widening the experiment, and her curiosity will only intensify with it as we go into episode 3. Coming home to an empty house after the shooting, the Navi's light and constant flicker of images is the only life in the room. She crawls toward it, entranced, as if drawn to some salvific glow. In the middle of this hypnotic scene, she finds herself in the bearsuit, a symbol of submission, reinforcement of programming. Tonally, this sets up the episode. You'll notice it's quieter. The external chaos has faded. The auditory stimuli has retreated, leaving Lain and us alone. Alone with the traumatic programming we've endured. This episode is internalization, resembling the real-world post-trauma conditioning experiments, where after repeated exposure, subtle reinforcement is used to consolidate behaviour. For instance, when Lain is riding the train to school again, we hear the electrical hum of wires, and a voice is then heard.
You are not alone.
This is yet another programming reference. As I hinted at earlier, the electrical towers do have a relation to mind control. In the 1977 Senate hearing on MK Ultra programs, Sidney Gottlieb, one of the scheme's founders, admitted to experiments relating to elf waves and various other frequencies in relation to mind control. There have been reports of these waves being used to enforce certain messages. When the wave is only heard by a subject, it is often attributed to something like the voice of God, lending it an air of authority. Whether all of these reports are true, it's clear there has been an attempt to impact our psyche. This soft encouragement and reinforcement by our programmer is in contrast to Lain's mother, as Lain now has decided to no longer confide in her. Clearly, Lain is being shown to loathe the outer world, with its authority figures being undermined, and instead she dips her toes into the digital ocean. With the various attempts at internalization, the Knights, the group we've heard might be behind these experiments, may now feel safe to move further in their plan, which is maybe why Lain in this episode mysteriously receives the psychic processor chip, something that will enable a greater connection between the wired and consciousness. Interestingly, her handler father likely planted the chip, looking rather disgruntled when asked by Lain about the device, a sign of a heavy conscience brought about what he knows is about to happen once Lain installs the chip. Where the previous episode internalized the conditioning, this one externalizes it. The first real fruits of the experiment.
親なんていらない。人間なんてたった一人なんだよ。誰ともつながってなんかない。
These words are a stark shift from the shy girl we met before. The imprint of the wired's logic, the human condition is obsolete and the network is its replacement. By rejecting her parents, Lain rejects the human role of guidance and protection, leaving that space open for a different kind of authority. Perhaps for the so-called God we've heard rumours of. This change of disposition grows her father's unease. In a rare moment of resistance, he tells her the wired should only be seen as a communication system. Lain laughs it off, echoing the logic of her conditioning, dismissing his dated view. Whatever programming is going on, it's true the wired is beyond a mere communications network. It may seem the experiment has succeeded, but small cracks begin to show. Moments where Lain's awareness flickers through the conditioning. This becomes clearer with Phantoma, the augmented reality game created by the Knights. Framed as entertainment, it's actually another experiment, drawing users, especially children, into deeper contact with the wired. The game's violence culminates in the death of a young participant. This is significant. She already has partial knowledge of the Knight's presence in the wired, but this brutality is enough to make her start investigating. A chink in the armour, a crack of light piercing through her programming. So concerning that episode 5 will focus on reprogramming, a response to what's occurred. In episode 4, Lain stumbled upon something she shouldn't have seen, a dirty experiment by her own programmers. A moment that casts a cause for concern over our subject, a crack of light in the conditioning. Episode 5 responds to that blunder, not only addressing it but introducing the latter stages of programming. In fact, this episode explicitly resembles a counselling session. one of the clearest links to a real-world MKUltra style experiment we've encountered. The first thing we notice in this session is Lane's demeanour. Childlike, completely infantile, asking to be told a story by a floating doll. This is another anchor. Similar to how the bear costume works, it triggers and installs a childlike alter in Lane, a compliant personality that receives information without critical thinking or autonomy. The doll seems to suggest that Lane possesses omniscience, that she already knows every story. But the doll isn't the only strange item we see. The next anchor is a talking tiki mask, probably the most bizarre and ambiguous object. But it could evoke a kind of ritual submission to a higher power that fits with the father-like doll that guides Lane's curiosity toward the hidden god of the wired. Lane even admits she's spoken to this god, suggesting she's being drawn into a direct relationship with it, groomed to see herself as its disciple, its digital prophet. The tiki mask also symbolically casts Lane as a kind of shaman. Traditionally, the shaman bridges the physical and spiritual worlds, guiding others through unseen realms and mediating between human and divine. In Lane's case, she becomes the digital version of that figure, a shaman of the wired, connecting the virtual and the real, guiding others through the space that joins both worlds. The session patches the cracks in Lane's previous programming, while reinforcing greater submission and a greater goal. Through the various trigger anchors, she internalizes Erie's authority as a god, cementing her obedience and connection to the wired. The fruits of this programming are shown when Lane next arrives at school. Gone is last episode's confident building teen, back is the even more subdued schoolgirl. A side note in this non-linear episode is Lane's wired self. One of her personalities seems to be enacting the hallucinatory experiment we see with Mika. This difference in behaviour across her alters will form the next hurdle in overcoming her programming. Not every part of Lane is ready to awaken, but it's possible that new forms of herself will. Since control has been reasserted, the Knights take the next step in programming, projecting a vision of Lane depicted in Messiah-like glory. But what's the significance? To me, it seems like the Knights are mythologizing their work, lacing it with religious imagery to assert its importance. It's both external propaganda, as we see in the children glorifying the image, and internal reinforcement for Lane, designed to make her believe she is a god with a divine mission. It's as if Erie is creating a inverted Christian narrative. He will play the father, and now Lane gets to play the incarnated daughter, who will bring the new heaven to the wired. In many real ritual abuse cases, religious symbolism is weaponized in a similar way, used to sanctify control, to make obedience feel sacred, and to recast trauma as a divine mission. But this grand gesture doesn't seem to work. In fact, when returning home, this gesture seems to have irritated one of Lane's personalities. This alter, that possibly developed in episode 4, seems to have survived the programming, and is out for more than survival. She begins an investigation into the Knights. Through a few leads, she finds it might be connected to a man named Dr. Hodgson, who she is able to converse with in the wired. Hodgson, who suspiciously resembles Sigmund Freud, tells her of something called the Kensington experiment, a program designed to harness latent psychic power in children. Though successful, it evaporated the kids into oblivion. Precisely what the Knights are doing with the energy is not yet known, but the brutality of all this is waking Lane up. Fragments of awareness cutting through the conditioning. But this progress doesn't go unnoticed. When she steps out to investigate the men in black, her computer erupts into flames. The Knights will go to any length to contain her, realizing she's no longer entirely under their command. Episode 7 is a step back. The programming continues, but the show is making a greater point. and takes us on a new path. One connected to a larger trail in the understanding of mind control and intelligence at large. It begins like the rest. Lain has reverted to a submissive altar, one that finds itself agreeing and repeating Knight's philosophy, even acknowledging that other versions of her are becoming more and more different. But while this occurs, the path I talked about is beginning to be revealed. We find out that the men in black stalking Lain are supposed to be the Knight's ideological enemy, workers for Tachibana Labs, the same company Erie once worked for. When they take Lain in to be questioned by their boss, we are introduced to a clearly suspicious character, who we will later learn is an ideological puppet of Erie, and in reality, they're not just in alignment with the Knights, but they're using them as a tool. This presents a striking parallel to real-life intelligence operations and fringe cults. While the Knights appear chaotic and somewhat unserious, they function as a deliberate tool, guided to enforce ideology, propagate doctrine, and manipulate individuals, in this case to advance Erie's control over the wired. Historically, intelligence agencies have exploited cults in similar ways. The CIA has infiltrated or even created groups to study and manipulate belief systems, recruiting unstable or isolated members to serve larger strategic objectives. Charles Manson, for instance, had countless connections to CIA figures and known agency assets. One such link leads us to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, a Scientology spin-off cult that Manson was deeply familiar with, even adopting their theology into his grand Helter Skelter plan. Helter Skelter itself shares key similarities with the Process's doctrine, which aim to return society to a state of infancy and dependability through controlled shocks, making people more pliable to external influence. This mirrors the psychological framework in intelligence research. Kurt Lewin, one of the key figures in creating Tavistock, described how populations could be reset through systematic destabilization, breaking down social structures to be rebuilt in a new desired form. Many researchers note it's no coincidence that cults often echo the same methods outlined in Tavistock literature. Tavistock, a government-funded behavioural research institute, has long collaborated with Western intelligence agencies to study mass psychology, social conditioning, and propaganda. All of this to say that the Knights fit this mould well. Their logo alone tells the same story, a fusion of Masonic compass and an Illuminati star pyramid, a symbol that parodies the secret orders it seeks to imitate. We even see one unhinged member completely detached from reality. The kind of unstable personality groups like this are built to exploit. But beneath their chaos lays a focused aim to turn belief into obedience, all in service of Erie's control. In many ways, the Knights feel like the evolution of old world cults into the digital age. Decentralized, anonymous, and infinitely replicable. Where once you might have handed a friendly pamphlet from the Church of Scientology, now it's a Discord message, a forum post, an invite link that you and Lain accepted. Maybe now as we speak you've joined something far beyond what you understand. However revealing this all is, it only explains how the system builds its influence, not what happens when one of its creations begins to wake up. In episode 8, the focus narrows back to the personal, as finally, after all the clues and experiences converge, Lain's own programming begins to come undone. But as with every step forward, it takes one step back. The episode Rumours centres on Lain's allegedly spreading stories about her best friend, Alice, and her crush on her teacher. In the end, this proves true. A new Lain wearing an unsavoury smile is observing her friend's intimate moments. Some interpret this as her id, the raw, instinctive part of the psyche. This out-of-control id spurs Lain into action. The revelations from her digital selves, the spreading of rumours and breaches of privacy, force her to confront the fractures in her own psyche. With her offline selves now destabilised, she begins a journey to confront her sub-personalities, to take back control and restore coherence. The hurt of her one authentic friend forces a self-confrontation. Transformation begins. Psychologically, facing subpersonalities is essential to building a unified, coherent identity. A principle supported in clinical treatments of dissociative identity disorder. In this episode, this is symbolized through fire, the destruction of old selves outside the wired. The timid Lain dies, Lain's bear costume obliterated. Visions of chattering dolls, representations of fragmented identities, are dispelled. Fire here is both destruction and renewal, clearing space for a new, stable ego. Yet the wired complicates integration. Unlike standard DID therapy, Lain's digital selves cannot be fully confronted or unified. They persist in a constantly interacting network beyond her control. While her offline selves can be integrated, her wired selves remain independent, showing the limits of self-unification in a digital environment. She attempts to reset the timeline, to erase the harm she's caused, but it fails. Not just practically, but morally. In trying to override the pain, she acts selfishly, disregarding the humanity of those around her. The consequences of her actions remain, leaving both her and us, the viewers, disoriented, scrambling for an answer we don't have, but just in time for someone else to provide an alternative. In this episode, we're handed the alternative answer to Lain's troubles, and maybe our own, delivered through a heavy burst of information with a few unsettling plot details woven in that we'll uncover as we go. Erie dumps a pseudo-historical conspiracy reel, Roswell, MJ12, John C. Lilly's Echo, the Schumann resonance, all aimed straight at us, not Lain. No character on screen hears it. We have become the subject again. This reel stitches together aliens, collective consciousness, and a global network to promise evolution without pain. It's the collectivist antidote to Lain's and our identity crisis. Collectivist godhood, the perfect escape from being you. Meanwhile, we, the audience, are contrasted with Lain's individual identity crisis. Lain downloads her memories, meets her past self, the one just stepping into the hoax. When asked if she knows her family, she says she doesn't. She realizes the experiences she had to form her ego, her identity, are a lie. And suddenly, Erie's narrative looks like salvation. This is a control narrative, a fabricated story sold as truth to direct behaviour toward Erie's hive mind. In fact, the show knows it's fake. Roswell and MJ12, classic disinformation stories, intelligence agencies feeding the public hoaxes to shape belief. The UFO program itself has been known as a classic psychological warfare weapon. In 1978, under the Freedom of Information Act, we got the document Subject UFO. It explicitly admits exploiting UFO belief for mind control due to strong psychological reaction and widespread belief. Erie may or may not half believe his own myth, but the effect is the same. Total dominion over a mass surveilled collective. Lain's question becomes ours. Is this a better answer? From now on, the conditioning phase is complete. The subject, Lain, and you has been primed. Now the experiment observes. Will this programming hold? After episode 9, the trauma triggers and anchors fall silent. Erie's control narrative is installed. The show shifts from installation to a stress test. How does the subject behave when the cage doors are opened? We won't dissect every philosophical beat which becomes apparent here. Instead, we will track one metric. Do we, and Lain, accept the hive mind, or reject it, at the cost of everything? As episode 10 and 11, we see the seesaw between each option. Initially, after being tempted, Lain rejects the hive mind that Erie presents. Abandon your body and merge with the wired. Become God. She refuses. She clings to human life, to choice, to individuality. She tries to go back to school with her friends and the old routine. But the world she once knew is gone. Her classmates' memories are gone, her family fabricated, and her sense of belonging is now erased from episode 8. Most importantly, the scars she left on Alice still remain. Her father, before he disappears, does leave her with one line.
あなたはこれからどうしようと自由です。いや、最初からあなたは自由だったんだ。
Perhaps a small crack of light in the programming. In episode 11, Lain tries to repair what's been lost by resetting reality once again, reprogramming herself into the memories of those around her. She erases every trace of Alice's rumour, leaving only herself and Alice aware of what truly happened. But with this, a troubling question arises. By imposing her will on others and rewriting their perception, has Lain really created a world any different from Erie's?
Landscape. Layer 12.
Episode 12 gives us the answer. Submission.
では次のメッセージです。レインを好きになりましょう。レインを好きになりましょう。レインを好きになり、レインをレイン。
The world is empty, coalescing in the Wired, and Protocol 7 is almost here. The difference from Erie's dystopia? None, except the forced worship of Lain, a bandage over the scars of her human experience. Lain has made her choice. But one memory remains untouched. Alice. Why? Alice is the only bond Lain formed without manipulation or interference. To Lain, she is a precious jewel, the last fragment of humanity she refuses to let go. She can't explain why, but she somehow knows it beats the collectivism she's installed. Even in surrender, a part of her still rejects Erie's collectivism. Lain didn't enact Erie's vision out of preference, but out of pain, out of programming he forced upon her. In this episode, we receive Erie's programming and philosophy in a neat little manifesto statement. A manifesto Lain will briefly echo in the episode, which goes something like this. The body, and by extension the mind, is nothing more than a machine governed by material laws. The physical form is a flaw in evolution, a prison halting humanity's progress. If mankind's downfall is decided by biology's limits, it's as if a non-existent god condemned us to failure. Erie's solution? Remove those limits entirely. He claims human beings carry the accumulated information of their ancestors, data that only gains power when shared. By reconnecting this through the Wired, humanity can evolve on its own terms, restoring the unconscious unity it apparently once had. To Erie, Lain is proof of that consciousness can transcend flesh, and humans can play God themselves. Lain repeats this sentiment to Alice, calling her a machine, but Alice disagrees, placing her hands on Lain's beating heart. Not logic, but the human heart, presenting a symbol of humanity's faculties beyond its mechanical functions, something the materialist Erie's worldview could never understand. In this moment of realization, she's compelled to question Erie's godhood. How has he the divine right to enact this world? How is he a god when his theories and plans were something he was given? How could he understand Lain's love for the human experience when he is without a human body? A challenge Erie's inflated ego must accept, but one he will not overcome. This isn't just Lain's victory. It's the experiment's final payload delivered to us. Erie's materialism isn't anime lore. It's the exact worldview that justified MKUltra and every other horror Lain endured. The monologue wasn't for Lain, it was psychic driving, aimed at you, to see if you'd accept the machine man myth. Erie says everything about man can be understood materialistically, including the mind. This view exists in psychology too. Before 1870, psychology was the study of the soul or mind, closer to philosophy than strict empirical science. But Prussian state psychologist Wilhelm Wundt would change everything. He switched to a completely materialistic view. Unless it can be scientifically quantified, it isn't worth considering. All psychological studies must be based on physiology, bodily reactions, the nervous system, and chemicals. Under him, man was redefined as simply machine. If man is merely a determined machine, what's wrong with tampering with him? With vile experiments, with using him as an electrical node in an interconnected matrix to supposedly further human evolution. If there's no inherent purpose to man's ontology, it's no stretch for men like Erie to construct one for the rest of us, to play God. At this point, we the subject are being asked to answer this. We may have overcome our programming, but if we're all just machines, how can we chastise another device's results?
Echo. Layer 13.
In the conclusion, Lain resets reality. Everyone who died is back alive. No trace of Protocol 7, the Knights, or the Wired's chaos. Even Erie gets a new career. Normalcy is restored, but the philosophy that built the world we saw is still here. Outside this show, outside this screen, waiting for an answer. Lain's answer as the emergent god of the internet is to step back as an omniscient observer. One with the powers of a god, but without accepting the role that comes with it. Why? Her choice is rooted in existentialism. For the existentialist, existence precedes essence. You are not born with purpose, you define it yourself through total freedom. Another key principle within existentialism is bad faith, which is any external force that denies to create one's essence. Lain recognizes this trap at every turn. First, she refuses to impose her will or the Wired's on others. No more force worshipped, no more defining reality for anyone else. The dystopia gone, since that would be bad faith. She won't let Erie, the Knights, or the network dictate essences for anyone. Second, she refuses the god role herself, because accepting it will be her own bad faith. Irie assigned her that title. Taking it without her own volition would be surrendering to his script, so she rejects it. Not out of weakness, but to preserve authentic freedom. Now, to scale that down. Clearly, the existentialist approach warns that, like Lain, individuals need a healthy boundary with the internet, a space where the self isn't endlessly rewritten. Online, identity splits. One avatar for work, one for venting, one for curation. Others also shape you, a stranger's meme, a tagged photo, a data profile. Lineality disappears in this constant exchange of information. Past selves linger and overlap. When one mask bleeds into another, the core self fractures. Existentialism sees this as a bad faith on steroids. External and self-imposed forces stealing your freedom to define a coherent essence. But there's an issue. Existentialism warns against defining what man is, yet in refusing to do so, it leaves us defenseless. If essence is always self-created, then in a fragmented digital world, the self becomes endless construction with no core. We need man's objective essence, not to erase individuality, but to understand the direction man is oriented toward. Thanks for watching.